start out with, I'm coming in with Scale 75 Matte Black, and I'm going to be painting this over all the areas that we want to have our metallic effect on. And I always recommend starting out with a matte black rather than a satin or a gloss black, as it allows us to have much more finer control over our shadow tones and incorporates much nicer into the non-metallic feel, which often uses very matte paints to tell the effect rather than using satin or gloss finish paints. For the first highlight, I'll be coming in with Petroleum Grey from Scale 75. And this is a dark grey colour that has a little bit of a purple hue into it. Although this won't show much in the final product, it will give some subtle colouring into our greys so that it's not just a straight black to white transition, it has some tonal variety. And the idea with this paint is we're going to follow our basic rules of lighting when doing non-metallic metal style things. So, for example, on the flat side of the Balkans ammo magazine, I have painted most of the flat side, leaving a darker band at the top. The idea is that the sun is going to be hitting this. Apart from a very strong light at the top as a reflex, the lower down that flat panel you get to, the more light is being hit by a sun at a lower angle. And so we need to paint more of the lighter colours towards the bottom of these panels. I'm still painting up the sides along the top of these panels as well, but we are leaving that dark band up at the top there. When it comes to doing circles and cylinders, we want to be focusing in a similar theory, but focusing on where that light would catch. A real trick here is to shine a light onto your miniature, take a photograph of it, put it onto your computer or your phone and set it to black and white, and you can see where all the highlights and shadows are. And what we want to do is to use that as a reference to have a guide for painting in this highlight colours. And don't worry if you go too light with any of these, we can always come back in with a shadow colour later. I'm going to be using this magazine as an example, but we are still looking to paint probably about 75% of each surface, leaving a darker band at the top to act as our shadow colour. Once that has dried, I'll be coming in with our next highlight colour, and this will be a 50-50 mix of a matte black and graphene grey from Scale 75. If you don't have graphene grey from Scale 75, then Mechanica Standard Grey from Games Workshop is a close match. And with this, I'm looking to start making a smaller area highlight on the previously painted colours. So what I'm going to be doing here is looking to paint about 50% of previously covered area with this paint. Now, we're going to lose some of that purple tone that we had from the petroleum grey from Scale 75, but that's okay. We're looking for a very clean metallic with this effect, so it doesn't matter too much. This is going to be a lot more cool rather than the warm tones of petroleum grey. With this, making sure that the lightest area is at the bottom. As you can see there, we're looking to cover about 50% of the previous area. If you wet your brush off, you can go backwards and forwards quickly to soften out any transitional edges you might have between the colours. And the thinner you keep your paint, the smoother this transition is going to be. The idea with doing these non-metallic surfaces is that if you do some directional strokes to bring in the paintbrush up from where you want your strongest highlight colour to be, most pigment is left there, and keeping your paint nice and thin and doing this across in multiple layers and passes will lead to a much smoother finish and sell the effect better than trying to get blocky areas. You can do this in blocky colours, and you might see people do it on YouTube tutorials where they block in like a shadow, a mid-tone highlight, and then soften the areas between them, but my brain doesn't work that way, and I tend to go from dark to light. I find that doing that tends to work better for me, but it might work better for you to do mid-tones and then soften out with transitional tones. So just like in the previous step, covering about 50% of our previously coloured area, focusing on having nice thin passes and taking our time with our brush. And don't worry if you make any mistakes or if you think you cover too much area, you can always go back in with your previous colour and change up the tonal variances. Now that I'm happy with my 50-50 mix highlight, I have come back in and added exactly the same amount of graphene grey from scale 75 that was in the previous mix, and I'm adding it onto the model. And with this I'm starting to do first edge highlights and starting to cover probably about 50% of the previously painted area. This is now going to start looking a lot more grey, and when it comes to our edge highlights, we want to start looking at painting around every single edge at this point. Grey tones are going to become a lot cooler in tone rather than those warm black and petroleum grey, so we'll start to shift this into a colder direction and more of that metal steel feel. And at this point, due to this is a very mid-tone colour, we want to basically be highlighting every edge. Try and use the edge of the brush where you can, and try to focus on those simpler shapes like rectangles and squares at first before you tackle the round parts, so that you get comfortable with the idea of highlighting in this way. There's no new trick in this part. Basically what we've done is made the colour slightly lighter with the adding more grain to the mix and covering an even smaller area, focusing exactly on where the light would hit. You can see in the back of this magazine here, we're focusing towards the bottom, leaving those previous colours into the shadows. The more area you cover with this, the more grey your finish is going to look. Don't worry, you can always go back in with previous colours. You can remake mixes, you can go back. It doesn't matter if you make mistakes or if you're unhappy with the exact nature of a transition of colour. Make sure you keep your paint thin. It's better to do this in several passes, keeping everything thin, than it is trying to cover that small area with one thick coat of paint, because it's not going to work for this non-metallic metal look. And here we have the Storm Bolter with those initial few shades of grey applied. For our next highlight, we'll be coming in with pure graphene grey from scale 75. This is a really nice, cool toned grey colour. And as you can see, I'm starting out with some edge highlights to help define the shapes of this Storm Bolter magazine, and this will help guide me on exactly where I'm wanting to put my next set of highlights. There's no trick to edge highlighting apart from using the side of your brush when you can, and just like in all the previous steps where we've done any highlighting, we're going to be going around all edges of the shapes on the side of the Storm Bolter. This is the real trick with non-metallic metal, is you're going to be looking at doing lots and lots and lots of edge highlighting on top of that gradient that you're building up. And here you can see I'm painting again half of my previously painted area. The paint is quite thin. It's thick enough that one pass on an edge highlight is enough, but thin enough that once I rinse my brush off, I can quickly move it backwards and forwards to soften out that transition area. I'm doing rapid motions with the brush, doing pushing of the paint in two directional, so I'm pulling downwards to get that initial highlight onto the model. And as you can see, it's really starting to pop now, but if I feel like I've gone too high, I quickly rinse off the brush and move backwards and forwards and feather out the edges and soften that transition between the two colours. Again, I'm just going to go onto the other side of this magazine, starting out with those edge highlights. I'll be painting, again, about 50% of what's previously cut. The trick with this is to pick a small area at a time. Non-metallic metal is a process that takes a long time to do. The more stages you have as you add your lighter colours in, the smoother that appearance looks, and the more you're going to be able to sell the metallic effect. Contrast is a really important thing here, so we want to make sure that any edge highlights we're doing on quite dark areas, like at this very small angle at the top of the magazine, that we're being as neat as possible as we can. Don't worry if we make mistakes. We'll come back in with a black or the petroleum grey to really help push that shadow colour. Here we have the Storm Bolter magazine once that graphite grey has been applied. For the last grey highlight, I have added some white into the graphene grey to make a 50-50 mix. This is probably close to Administratum grey or light grey from Viejo. With this, I'm once again going around and doing all the edge highlights on this magazine. As you can see, this is quite a stark difference here, so we're going to be very careful when we are doing the larger areas onto the magazine. It's okay at a normal thickness for doing these edge highlights, but when we start to cover up onto the flat panels, we want to make sure that we thin our paint down just a little bit so that we can feather out those transitions. Now, for these edge highlights, we want to be going around all the edges with this. Normally when I teach edge highlighting, I teach doing the upper areas, but when it comes to non-metallic metal, to really sell the idea of everything being metal, we're wanting to go hit every single edge. We want to give as much opportunity to show the idea of this shining. With this here, I've got some thin paint and I'm sort of pushing pigment into the edge highlight, so it's a bit of almost like a chunky edge highlight at that point, but the edge softens out. As an optional, you can pick out these rivets here, they're on the side. We're going to come in with some white later and pick those out. Here I am just edge highlighting the bottom of the magazine, and once I've got that edge highlight down, I can now start to look to think about painting these flatter areas of the panel. For this highlight, I would recommend thinning down your grey-white mix just that little bit extra than normal, so that you have that extra control on pushing and feathering out the edges of this. If you're feeling really confident, you can leave a bit of a darker grey sort of in the middle of this to give the idea that there is a change in colour variance in that middle. That's cast shadow from the bolt round display, I guess. I'm from the UK. We don't really do guns over here, so apologies for any inaccuracies in what parts are called. But yeah, I'm focusing on that very top edge, pushing into that line highlight, and then into the bottom corners and that very bottom edge with the magazine. And we're going to repeat exactly the same thing on the other side. For the last highlight, we're going to be coming in with some white from Scale 75. You can use any white that you'd like. I'd recommend picking a matte white, and I particularly like the Scale 75 one over others for this purpose, as the Scale 75 white feathers out much nicer than other whites I've used. It's not as good as coverage, so I tend to use Viejo matte white if I'm doing white painting on flatter areas, but for this non-metallic metal effect, I find that the Scalecolor one sort of softens naturally at the edges and lends itself to almost like a natural blend. And this is a very straightforward step, and what we're going to be doing with this is just edge highlighting every edge, every corner, and picking out all the rivet details. But this is the final step that will really cause everything to pop on this non-metallic metal area. If you feel like once you've added this, everything's gone really bright and you've lost your shadows, you can always come back in with black paint, and you can thin it right down to a glaze consistency, and you can push that into the shadows around the ridges and start to redefine some of the flatter areas to increase the contrast, as that push on the contrast is what sells that non-metallic metal effect. And here we have the finished non-metallic metal magazine on the Storm Bolter. As with all advanced techniques, the trick with this is just to practice. Pick a small area like a magazine or a small round piece on an armor, or the barrel of a gun, and just find that. I'd recommend rectangles as a starting point, but just finding an area for you to practice getting these color transitions right. You're never going to get it right first time, you probably won't get it right second time, but don't be disheartened. Keep going back and practicing those transitions, and soon you'll find yourself being quite comfortable in doing techniques like this, and utilizing these same techniques with different colors allows you to paint this onto armor panels and cloth and fabric, and really get you a good idea of how different materials work in painting. If you like this tutorial, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and you get further videos just like this one in your YouTube feed. So, until next time, folks.